So a couple of days ago, a relative of mine sent me this list of supposed USAID spending, asking me if I could fact check it. There are thousands of claims circulating online right now of insane waste by USAID, and I don't have the time to fact check them all. If I do this list, there's going to be another list and another one and another one, and that's going to take better funded, better staffed news organizations than myself to do that kind of endless line-by-line fact-checking. So we will talk about whether this list passes the smell test, but in order to do that, we're going to have a look at the bigger picture of USAID, government spending, and the reality behind the Trump administration's approach to government efficiency, so you can apply the same frame of reference in the coming weeks and months when you're inevitably facing a fire hose of dubious information from DoGE supporters, whether it's about USAID, the Department of Education, or whatever next agency they want to dismantle. First of all, it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the information circulating online right now is mixed reliability information. Even Elon Musk, who has access to line item spending information for literally every government agency, and supposedly some of the information he's sharing is true, he's also retweeting proven fake news about USAID spending, like this video that is part of a pro-Russia disinformation campaign about supposed USAID funding of celebrity trips to Ukraine, or this claim that the head of USAID made $23 million in 4 years, which is just literally made up. And he knows that it's made up, he has access to all the numbers, and it's not being backed up with any evidence. This is a classic disinformation tactic of mixing fabricated disinformation with genuine information. So on one hand, the genuine stuff lends credibility to the fake stuff, and some people are going to be convinced that the fake stuff is real. And on the other hand, once you know that there's disinformation mixed in, that causes you to doubt everything. And because there's so much information coming out all at the same time, you're completely overwhelmed. It's impossible to fact check everything, so you just disconnect. And that is the point. So, rule of thumb, apply general skepticism about everything you see on these issues. There's a claim circulating online right now that USAID spent $600 million on sushi for its staff. That came from a parody account that people took seriously. Or the claim that USAID spent $8 million in 2024 to prop up the news website Politico, a claim that the White House press secretary furthered.
Including Politico.
And according to Donald Trump, this was meant to create positive stories for the Democrats. But in reality, USAID spent a grand total of $24,000 in Politico subscriptions for its staff and had no editorial influence. That $8 million number, which is the total US government spending on Politico services, is a completely different thing, which is mostly subscriptions to Politico's professional dashboards that give granular information on public policy, which is why that's super expensive, and even staffers in the Trump administration bought Politico Pro subscriptions because they need that information. But if you simplify that to Politico is state-funded media because the government gave them $8 million, that sounds really bad. It's also, and bear with me here, not true. And it should tell you something that they feel the need to lie about these. Anyway, back to USAID. What is USAID, or the United States Agency for International Development? Well, it's in the name. They do international development aid. That includes economic development, infrastructure, jobs training, but it's also building schools and hospitals, delivering vaccines and medicine, humanitarian aid, and human rights initiatives, among plenty of other things. And I know some people who work in these kinds of organizations, they're insufferably idealistic and well-intentioned, but let's be clear here. The US government didn't create USAID out of the goodness of their hearts. USAID is an arm of US soft power as opposed to, the hard kind. The US benefits from having a peaceful, prosperous, stable, more or less democratic world that they are the leader of. That last one being the one that matters most to the US. And soft power is one of the most, if not the most, cost-effective tools for that. During the Cold War, the US and its allies spent about $1 billion funding Mujahideen fighters against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. After the USSR was defeated and withdrew from the country, the Reagan administration was satisfied with that victory, and they refused to fund any kind of development program. This was dramatized in the film Charlie Wilson's War, but the real Charlie Wilson, who was a congressman from Texas played by Tom Hanks in the film, he wrote in the Washington Post in 2008, after the Mujahideen victory over the invading Soviet army, congressional appropriators turned down my request for funds to rebuild Afghanistan's schools, road, and economy. If we had done the right thing in Afghanistan then, following up our military support with the necessary investment in diplomacy and development assistance, we would have better secured our own country's future, as well as peace and stability in the region. That's the kind of project that would have been given to USAID, and it would have cost pennies on the dollar compared to what the CIA spent against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. The decision not to spend that money came back to spectacularly bite the US in the ass. Not only does soft power help create the kind of global economy that brings in more money through international trade than what the US spends on soft power, but it also helps avoid wars that are way more costly both economically and in human terms than the cost of soft power. The war in Afghanistan on its own cost an estimated $2.3 trillion between 2001 and 2022. That's over $100 billion a year, which is more than double the average total yearly budget of USAID, which includes all of its programs all over the world. How many $2 trillion wars did those programs help prevent over the years is a question that I would rather we didn't need to find out the answer to. The reality is, development aid is cheaper than war, but it is expensive. By definition, most of the money is spent in unstable countries, and if it's unstable, that spending is almost inherently going to be wasteful. It's harder to get building materials where you need them to go because the infrastructure sucks, and once you start building, it's very common that corrupt contractors or officials skim money off the top. And in addition to that, NGO workers will tell you how frustrating it is to build a school or dig a well or build a road somewhere, and a couple of years down the line, nobody's using them anymore. Part of that is the well-intentioned incompetence of Western NGO workers failing to listen to or understand the needs of the people they're trying to help, and that is a huge conversation that is already happening in the humanitarian field about trying to find better methods to achieve their goals. But another part of that is unstable countries are unpredictable. In a particularly bad example, USAID Agriculture Development Funds ended up helping poppy farmers in Afghanistan. Yeah, not good. Or in another case, also in Afghanistan a few years ago, they budgeted $300 million with the goal of helping 75,000 women get better jobs, but they pulled the plug on that program after spending 90 of that $300 million and realizing that they only helped 55 women. Not 55,000, 55 individual women. And you know, that's gonna happen. Part of the difficulty of development aid is sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can't know in advance which dollar you spend is gonna go to waste, or save lives, or line the pockets of corrupt officials. So the armchair quarterbacks can point to clearly egregious mistakes like those to discredit the agency as a whole, but not using soft power at all can cause much more disastrous consequences than using it with mixed results. And a big reason why China is gaining influence globally, while the US is falling behind, is arguably because they're using more soft power than the US, investing about $85 billion a year in infrastructure projects in developing countries as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. And ironically, Trump's answer to China having gained influence in the Panama Canal through soft power is to threaten military action to retake the canal by force while shutting down the US's main soft power agency. Of course, you can argue that Chinese soft power doesn't come with human rights strings attached, but US spending on human rights buys the US influence on human rights issues on the global stage. And there's a ton of valid criticism of the US on human rights issues. It definitely has double standards and blinders when it comes to criticizing its allies. Again, it's about strategic interest. They're not doing this in the name of freedom and the American way. The US isn't Captain America. They're, for the most part, Captain America. But the US's hypocrisy and double standards on human rights issues doesn't invalidate the human rights spending that they do, in fact, do. What is crazy is that for all the criticism you can make of US foreign policy, USAID is unironically and unambiguously the best thing they do. It's the thing that buys them the most goodwill around the world, that they then squander by drone bombing weddings or torturing detainees or supporting other governments that do even worse things. And getting rid of that is the first major foreign policy move by the new administration other than threatening to annex like 4 countries at this point. What the dismantling of USAID says is that the US is walking away from the issue of human rights altogether, which is also why they walked away from the UN Human Rights Council. Over the last 3 years, the total budget of USAID was about $50 billion a year. That's a lot, but it's also less than 1% of the total US budget. USAID had a staff of about 10,000 people that's now been reduced to just under 300. So with that context in mind, let's have a look at that list that my relative sent me. I haven't been able to confirm or debunk any of these items, but let's apply some critical thinking. I'll hit on this one first because I find it kind of funny that it's mentioned as part of this funding controversy. $31 million in USAID employee counseling. Okay, $31 million a year for 10,000 employees ends up being an average of $60 per employee per week. And I know that conservatives hate therapy, but considering the field that they're in, where I'm sure that a lot of USAID employees are working with activists on the ground getting murdered, or spending huge amounts of effort and time and money on places that don't seem to catch a break and get hit by a series of civil wars and terrorist attacks and natural disasters and epidemics and famines. Yeah. So I did my master's thesis in risk management for media companies, and part of that was obvious things like best practices for journalists in war zones, but another part of that I didn't realize until I started to work on my thesis was that journalists who aren't on the field, who work in a newsroom and cut graphic footage of war zones and natural disasters, can get PTSD from watching that kind of footage 8 hours a day, and that happens way more often than you'd think, even if they're not physically at risk. I'll tell you from experience that having to cut footage of a teenager's hand being blown off by a concussion grenade and watching that frame by frame, not the most pleasant thing I've worked on. And for people who work on those kinds of issues for years at a time, the company budgeting a $60 therapy session per week as an employment perk, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. A lot of these other initiatives like gender diverse support in Bangladesh, LGBT support in Honduras, Syria, the Caribbean, Cambodia, again, these don't seem insane to me. I know LGBT rights are controversial, but LGBT rights are human rights even if you don't like them. I had a friend 10 years ago who worked for a gender-based violence NGO in Malaysia, so that's trying to address issues like domestic violence, but also gay and trans people being attacked and often murdered, or child sex trafficking, which is an issue that I think MAGA supporters care about a lot. And most of their funding came from USAID, so when Trump came into office in 2017 and slashed their budget during his first term, they had to shut down. And when you do those kinds of things, that means people dying. Same goes with not distributing AIDS or malaria treatments. Hey, if you're enjoying the video so far, please leave a like and comment. It really helps with the algorithm. This video is brought to you by USAID. No, I'm joking. Seriously though, this video is brought to you by the good people who support the channel on Patreon. And considering how long it's been since the last YouTube video we put out, I really need to thank the Patreon supporters for still sticking around. But there's a lot more happening with the channel this year. Bit of behind the scenes drama. I spent most of last year negotiating the funding for and then doing pre-production for a docu-series that we were supposed to be shooting right now. And it was a dream project of mine that involved traveling to like 8 different countries to report on a really important human rights issue. And then last month, the whole project fell through and the budget never came. Nothing to do with USAID or DoGE or anything in the US, I promise. But my point is, now I have a super cool project that is already planned and ready to go, and I can't afford to do it. That's why it's so helpful to become a Patreon supporter. Not only does it allow me to spend time preparing for big projects, it would also avoid me wasting time negotiating for funding, and it would allow me to actually fund the projects and do them myself. And even for last minute things with no preparation. There's a big protest movement in Serbia right now. There was another one in Slovakia not too long ago. If I could afford to, I'd be over there filming it right now. So if you already support the channel on Patreon, thank you so much. If you don't, please consider it. And if you can't afford to, I'm already thankful that you're watching right now. There are also other options like coffee and YouTube donations. All the links are down below. And now let's get back to the video with a clip of CBS fact-checking some USAID spending.
There was a claim from the Trump administration that about $2 million was spent in USAID funds for a Moroccan pottery class. That is true. In 2009, USAID allotted about $27 million for an economic development project in Morocco. Now, pottery is an economic engine there, and their tile industry is world-renowned. A lot of tourists go there and make pottery. That's something that happens. But the question remains of why U.S. taxpayer dollars are being used to fund a program like this that was later found to be, quote, ineffective. There was also a claim that $20 million was spent on a Sesame Street show created for Iraq. This is also true. USAID used about $20 million of partner funding to work with the Sesame Street Workshop to produce a program that would promote inclusion, mutual respect, and understanding across ethnic, religious, and sectarian groups. That is a quote from their website. And this project was supposed to run from 2021 to 2027. Another claim that our team had fact-checked and looked at was that there was a $70,000 DEI musical that was being produced in Ireland. Also true. The Department of State, as a part of a public diplomacy program, awarded about $70,000 in 2022 for a live musical event that would promote the U.S. and Irish shared values of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is all a part of government record.
It is a part of government record. And the record says that last one wasn't USAID. That was the State Department, which doesn't really change that much, but it's a little weird that CBS is validating the DoGE narrative by blaming USAID for funding that came from a different department. Which, the fact that they didn't point out any of the lies and that they're using the loaded term of DEI musical for this should have made me suspicious to begin with. You might have also heard of the transgender opera that was funded in Colombia. That was also the State Department, not USAID. But what these are just cultural projects that promote diversity and acceptance, which is a pretty common theme in musicals, school plays, and cartoons.
Now you know my terrible secret! You're gay? Fine if you're gay, Butters, I don't care.
I mean, The Matrix is a trans allegory with fetish overtones, but we don't constantly call it that, do we? And then funding a Sesame Street show about mutual respect across religious and sectarian groups does seem absurd, but it's in Iraq, which has some of the worst sectarian and religious violence in the entire Middle East, in part because we toppled their government. And the lesson we should have learned from what we didn't do in Afghanistan in the 90s is, let's not. The point is, with a budget of $50 billion, if you go line by line without context for how these decisions were made, you're gonna find projects that seem ludicrous. But the projects that are being brought up in this whole conversation are a tiny portion of USAID's funding that is specifically being selected to discredit the agency. When you bring up only the kind of ridiculous-looking projects mixed in with fake claims like $50 million spent on condoms in Gaza, yeah, that was fake news, that didn't happen. Yeah, that does make the entire agency look bad when the bigger projects they fund are things like vaccines and medical trials that save thousands upon thousands of lives. They also fund training for independent journalists in dictatorships, which is why every dictator on Earth has celebrated the dismantling of USAID. It should also be pointed out that if we're only selecting for epic failures and wasted money, USAID can't hold a candle to the Defense Department that has a budget of $900 billion a year. But I don't hear DoGE talking about shutting down the Pentagon. I always knew this in the back of my mind, but it suddenly clicked the other day and I was able to put into words something that I had never been able to formalize before, which is so many politicians run on their business record. And at face value, that makes sense, right? A businessman is going to run government like a business and everything is going to be so much more efficient with no more waste and no more red tape, right? But that is flawed on so many levels. There's a reason why businesses are able to run more efficiently than government, and that's one, because businesses are for profit and government is not. So you can cut spending programs that don't get you an immediate return on investment, but how do you measure the return on investment of human rights or minimum standards for worker rights? You know, basic worker rights are actually bad for business. That's why businesses don't like basic standards for worker rights, but a good politician will tell you government isn't about the money, it's about making lives better. That doesn't exist in business. Businesses have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to maximize profit, not quality of life. And that leads into the second point, which is even more important. Government is supposed to be run for the benefit of the entire population, while businesses are run for the benefit of a small handful of rich shareholders. Just to be clear, I'm not saying there's no place in government for people with business experience. It's a good thing for someone who knows what it's like to start a business to be involved in government so that if there are problems with that process, they know what they are and how to address them. That's why there are things like ease of doing business reports. But that kind of thinking applies to literally everything else. You want people from all walks of life to be represented in government so that the people in government have the lived experience and know what problems regular people are facing. Isn't there a 3-letter acronym that starts with D and ends with I that was meant to address that? Oh yeah, and the Trump administration got rid of it. So the Silicon Valley mentality is move fast and break things. But when you move fast and break things in government, people die. And in business industries where moving fast and breaking things or cutting corners causes people to die, that's what government regulations are for. Like construction companies, we know that if they can save a buck on building materials, they definitely will. And in addition to that, government provides a safety net for when a corporation is too efficient to the detriment of its own employees. Like Walmart is so efficient that they don't even pay their employees enough to live, so the employees have to rely on government food stamps. That's great for Walmart shareholders, but the government has to pick up the slack. So when a politician tells you they're going to run government like a business, they're saying they're going to run it for the benefit of a very few people at the top by defunding programs and cutting taxes for the wealthy. And that screws over a lot of people. So to sell that idea, proponents of small government like, say, Ronald Reagan, this guy.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
He used the myth of the welfare queen to justify defunding government. The welfare queen idea was wildly overblown. It never really happened. They also use the idea of waste, fraud, and abuse to shut down entire departments rather than actually making them more efficient. Okay, are there problems with waste, fraud, and abuse in government? Yeah. Is it unreasonable to want to deal with that and make government more efficient? Of course not. But that's why there are agencies like the Government Accountability Office that does audits for Congress. It's ironic that in the name of government efficiency, rather than giving more power to the Government Accountability Office, the agency that should be dealing with government efficiency, they created an entirely new redundant department. It's almost like they have a different goal in mind, and having no congressional oversight and no confirmation vote allows them to do whatever they want. According to the Government Accountability Office, the US loses between $233 and $521 billion a year in waste, fraud, and abuse. The real number is going to be somewhere in the middle. And yeah, that's a lot, but a huge portion of that is tax evasion. The tax gap, which is the difference between what the US should be collecting in taxes and what it actually collects, is $600 billion a year, according to the IRS. And to be fair, not all of the tax gap can be explained by tax evasion. There are other factors at play, but tax evasion only by millionaires and billionaires accounts for an estimated $150 billion a year. That's 3 USAIDs, and combating tax evasion pays for itself. You get more money back in recovered taxes than what you spent trying to recover those taxes. It's an incredibly efficient use of government money, and yet the Trump admin wants to defund the IRS. This isn't about government efficiency. It's kleptocracy. Because in the meantime, they also shut down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a wildly successful agency that held banks accountable for screwing people over. And now Elon Musk has a partnership with Visa to turn X, into a payment system. And they also shut down the National Labor Relations Board that safeguards worker rights against abusive employer practices. And for good measure, they're shutting down the Department of Education because who needs funding for schools, right? They also got rid of an anti-oligarch program and made it legal to bribe foreign officials. It would be one thing to see a department staffed by people who believe in the value of government, dedicated to making agencies better at delivering on their missions in a more streamlined and less expensive way, but this isn't more efficient. It's removing entire sections of the government altogether. What we're seeing is someone who is at best ideologically opposed to the government helping people, and at worst has a vested interest in getting rid of departments and regulations that are an obstacle to his own business interests. It turns out, 4 months before Musk shut down USAID, the Inspector General at the organization, who's now been fired, announced an investigation into waste, fraud, and abuse related to a partnership with Starlink, which belongs to Elon Musk. And out of the 17 Inspectors General fired since Trump took office, at least 5 were investigating Elon Musk's businesses. If you think all of this is unrelated to what we're seeing happening right now, I have a Sesame Street episode to sell you. The way the US government is supposed to work is Congress has the power of the purse. That's in the Constitution. Congress passes the budgets and decides what the government spends, not the president. And under the guise of government efficiency, Trump allied with the richest man on earth to completely take control of one of Congress's main responsibilities and retool it to benefit Trump's oligarchs.